The neon glow of Dawson's diner flickered against the damp pavement, casting soft blue and red hues onto the empty parking lot. The distant hum of traffic from the highway blended with the occasional buzz of the diner's old sign, creating a familiar rhythm that Emily Carter had learned to tune out. She adjusted her apron strap and rubbed the fatigue from her eyes. One more hour. That was all that stood between her and collapsing into bed after a double shift. But as she wiped down the counter, she heard Frank's gruff voice calling from the kitchen. "Em, hold up. Got a customer just walked in." Emily stifled a sigh. The dinner rush had long died down, and by now, it was usually just the truckers grabbing coffee before hitting the road again. She grabbed her notepad and turned toward the entrance. Her breath caught. The man sitting in the far booth wasn't a trucker. He wasn't some weary traveler looking for a cheap meal, either. Clint Eastwood. The name slammed into her like a gust of wind. He sat alone, hat pulled low, hands folded over a faded menu. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking him. The lines on his face told stories of decades spent in the spotlight. Yet his presence was anything but loud. He exuded the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove, yet commanded attention without asking for it. Emily swallowed hard. She wasn't the type to get starstruck, but this was different. Her father used to talk about him all the time. They'd sit in their tiny living room, watching those old westerns on a secondhand TV with a crack in the corner of the screen. "That's a real man, Emmy," her father used to say. "A man who doesn't have to raise his voice to be heard." She tightened her grip on the notepad, returning to the present. He was just a customer, a man ordering food. That was all. Emily squared her shoulders and approached the booth, her voice steady, more than she expected. "Good evening, sir. What can I get started for you?" Clint barely glanced at the menu before setting it aside. "Coffee, black, and the catfish platter. Simple, no fuss." Emily jotted it down and turned to leave when his voice stopped her. "Busy night." She hesitated. He wasn't asking just to be polite. There was something genuine in his tone. She gave a small smile. "Not too bad. Keeps me on my toes." He nodded, eyes scanning the diner. "You move fast. Not easy to keep up a pace like that in a place like this." The comment threw her off guard. Clint Eastwood, noticing her work ethic, she let out a soft chuckle, shifting her weight slightly. "Well, no one likes a slow waitress." Clint's lips curved, barely a smile, but something close. Emily walked back toward the counter, their heart still hammering. Luis was leaning against the kitchen pass-through, arms crossed, watching the exchange with open curiosity. "Okay," he said, smirking. "I've seen a lot of things in this diner, but Clint freaking Eastwood giving you a work evaluation? That's new." Emily shot him a look as she grabbed the coffee pot. "Don't start." Luis chuckled, flipping a sizzling catfish fillet on the grill. "I'm just saying, man's been in here 5 minutes, and he's already impressed. You should ask him for a job in Hollywood." Emily rolled her eyes but couldn't deny the strange warmth creeping into her chest. She returned with Clint's coffee and noticed him watching the front door. A group of men had just walked in, tourists, judging by their loud conversation and the way they squinted at the menu like it was written in another language. Emily recognized the type immediately. Men who never had a fight for anything. Men who filled the space around them like they owned it. They took a booth near Clint's, laughing too loud for the near-empty diner. Emily forced a neutral expression as she approached. "Evening, gentlemen. What can I get for you?" One of them, tall, blonde, in his early 40s, looked her up and down before grinning at his friends. "Didn't expect to get such fine service this late." The others chuckled. Emily's stomach tightened. "Just coffee," another one said, still smirking. "Unless you're on the menu too, sweetheart." Heat crawled up her neck. She had dealt with worse. She knew how to brush these moments aside, laugh them off, and move on. But before she could react, a deep voice cut through the air. "That's enough." The laughter died instantly. Clint Eastwood was looking at them now and not moving, not raising his voice and just watching. And yet, the entire energy in the room shifted. The blonde man let out a forced chuckle. "Relax, soul man. We're just having some fun." Clint didn't blink. "I said that's enough." Silence stretched. The air thickened around them, the tension palpable. The tourists exchanged uneasy glances. Then, with an awkward cough, the blonde one leaned back. Whatever. Just the coffee. Emily exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. She nodded, scribbled down the order, and walked back toward the counter, her hands trembling. Frank, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop from the register, muttered under his breath, "Damn. That man could stop a hurricane with a look." Luis whistled low. "I swear if I ever get in a bar fight, I want him on my side." Emily barely heard them. She set the coffee pot down, glancing at Clint's booth. He had already returned to sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. As she brought the men their drinks, they avoided eye contact, speaking in hushed tones now. The tension hadn't entirely dissipated, but Clint had ensured they knew their place. Emily felt a strange mix of gratitude, relief, and something she couldn't quite name. When she returned to Clint's table, his plate was empty. He gestured to her with a slight nod. "Everything all right?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Clint met her gaze, then, just for a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a quiet understanding. "Perfect," he said simply. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out some bills, and placed them neatly on the table with a folded piece of paper. "Keep the change," he said, standing up, "and read this when you get a moment." Emily stared at the note, heart pounding. "Thank you," she said softly, unsure if he even heard her as he walked toward the door. The bell above it jingled, and just like that, he was gone. She stood frozen by the booth for a moment, staring at the note as if it might burn her fingers. What could he have possibly written? And why did it feel like this night was far from over? The diner was quiet now. The tourists had left. The hum of the overhead lights and the distant murmuring of the radio filled the space where voices once echoed. Emily stood near the booth, staring at the folded piece of paper Clint Eastwood had left behind. It felt heavier than it should, like it held something more than ink and paper. Luis leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her. "You gonna open it? Or are we gonna stand here all night?" Emily swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to rip it open. But another part, the bigger part, was afraid. Afraid of what? She didn't know. Frank shuffled past, grabbing the bills Clint had left and whistling low. "Damn, man left a tip big enough to cover your rent." Emily barely heard him. Her fingers tightened around the note. "Read it," Luis nudged. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she unfolded the paper. The words were written in firm, deliberate strokes. "Emily, I don't know much about you, but I've seen something rare in the short time I've been here. True resilience. Watching how you manage this place, even under pressure, reminds me of someone I once knew, someone who taught me the value of hard work and kindness. I don't know your whole story, but I can see in your eyes that you've carried more than your share of burdens. That's why I want to do something, no strings attached. Use this however you see fit, your child, future, or even a moment to breathe. I hope it brings you some peace. People like you deserve to be seen. And I see you." Something inside her cracked. Her throat tightened as she reached into the note and pulled out a check. Her breath hitched. $10,000. The number blurred through the sudden sting of tears. Luis let out a low whistle. "Holy!" She shook her head, voice barely above a whisper. This can't be real." Frank, now looking over her shoulder, let out a slow breath. "Well, sweetheart, if it ain't, he's got the best damn handwriting for a scam artist I've ever seen." Emily pressed the check against her chest, as if she were afraid it might vanish. Luis grinned. "So, what are you going to do with it?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. She had no idea. Frank patted her shoulder. "Take a minute. You've earned it." She nodded numbly and stepped away, heading for the back room. When the door shut behind her, she exhaled sharply, sliding down onto the worn-out bench where she usually took her 5-minute breaks. Her hands trembled as she stared at the check again. It wasn't just the money. It was the words. The fact that Clint freaking Eastwood, had looked at her and seen something more than just a waitress refilling coffee cups. She had worked, struggled, and fought to keep her head above water. And for the first time, someone had told her that was enough, that she was enough. A sob built in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She needed to call someone. Her fingers fumbled for her phone, and she dialed before she could think twice. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Ing? What are you doing up this late?" Evans sounded groggy, but the concern in her voice was immediate. Emily opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Then, I think I just got the biggest tip of my life. A pause. Then, sharper, what do you mean? Emily took a shaky breath. Clint Eastwood. He left me a check. $10,000. Silence. Then Evans let out a low, slow whistle. You're screwing with me. I'm dead serious. There was another beat of silence. Then, holy SH, Emily closed her eyes. I don't know what to do. You cash it, Evans said immediately. But, no bu. That money was given to you. You don't question a gift like that. You accept it. Emily hesitated. It feels wrong. Like, why me? I didn't do anything. Evans sighed. How many people just walk through life without seeing the ones grinding to survive? He saw you, and he chose to do something about it. Emily chewed her lip. Listen, Evans continued. If you don't use it for yourself, use it for Carrick. For his future. Carrick. Her gaze flickered to the framed photo she kept in the back room. A picture of her son at the beach last summer, laughing as he ran through the waves. She thought about the overdue rent, the second-hand sneakers he had outgrown. The stack of unpaid bills is sitting on her kitchen counter. She thought about the dream she had once had before life had beaten it out of her. College, a career in accounting, a life where she didn't have to live shift to shift, counting tips and hoping they were enough. Evan's voice softened. When did you last do something for you? Emily exhaled shakily. I don't even remember. Then maybe it's time. Emily closed her eyes. Maybe it was. She ended the call and sat there, staring at the check for a long time. Eventually, she slipped it back into the envelope and stood, smoothing down her apron. She had a decision to make. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to make it. The decision didn't come all at once. It came in waves, hesitation, doubt, then a quiet, growing certainty. Emily stood outside First Savannah Bank, the check tucked tightly in her purse. The morning sun reflected off the glass doors, and she saw herself in the reflection for a moment, shoulders squared, chin lifted, a woman on the verge of something new. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The teller, a young woman with curly red hair and bright eyes, glanced at the check and then back at Emily. That's quite a deposit. Emily forced a nervous smile. It is. The woman hesitated. Would you like to move some of it into a savings account? A savings account. The thought nearly made Emily laugh. When did she last have money she didn't need to spend immediately? Yes, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. I think I would. The transaction took only a few minutes. But when Emily walked out of the bank, the world felt different. Lighter. The weight on her shoulders had shifted for the first time in years. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something. That night, as Carrick sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the pages of a library book about space, Emily placed a brand-new pair of sneakers beside him. His eyes widened. You got me new shoes? She nodded, her throat tight. Try to find ones that'll make you run faster. Carrick grinned, slipping them on and bouncing to his feet. I'm going to be the fastest kid on the playground. Emily watched him race around the tiny apartment, her heart swelling. It wasn't just the sneakers. It was what they represented. A step forward. A few days later, Emily opened the door to Savannah Community College. The air smelled like coffee and paper, and the hallways buzzed with quiet energy. She clutched the folder in her hands that held her application for the accounting program. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. Can I help you? Emily inhaled deeply. I'd like to enroll. The next few weeks passed in a blur of motion. Emily worked her shifts at Dawson's Diner, balancing them with night classes. She learned about balance sheets and financial projections. She spent late nights at the kitchen table, poring over textbooks while Carrick slept. It wasn't easy. Some nights, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving towards something instead of just running in place. But then, everything nearly came crashing down. It happened late one evening, as Emily was wiping down the counter at the diner. A loud crash shattered the quiet. The glass exploded from the front window. Emily spun around, heart hammering, as Frank bolted out from the back. What the hell? A rock lay in the middle of the floor, surrounded by shards of broken glass. Luis sprinted outside, but the street was empty. Whoever had done it was already gone. Frank ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. Damn, kids. Emily swallowed hard. Something about it didn't feel random. Luis walked back in, shaking his head. Didn't see anyone, but I bet it's those drunk idiots from the other night. Frank sighed. I'll call someone to board up. Emily knelt, carefully picking up a jagged piece of glass. A flicker of doubt crept in. Was this a message? A warning? Had she somehow disrupted the balance of the universe by accepting that check? Later that night, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the now-repaired window of the diner from across the street, Evan's voice rang in her head. He saw you, and he chose to do something about it. Emily clenched her jaw. No, she hadn't done anything wrong by accepting help, and she sure as hell wouldn't let fear dictate what she did next. The idea came the next morning. She was refilling the sugar dispensers when she glanced up at the counter, where a framed newspaper clipping of Dawson's Diner from the 1980s sat, slightly tilted. Her gaze drifted to Frank, who was flipping through a stack of bills, rubbing his temple like he had a headache. That was it. She untied her apron and strode over. Frank, she said. He looked up, raising an eyebrow. You quitting on me? She shook her head. I want to help. He blinked. Help how? She glanced around the diner. This place, it's more than a diner. It's part of this neighborhood, and people need to see that. Frank leaned back, arms crossed. All right, I'm listening. A week later, the diner buzzed with life. The Dawson's Diner Community Night had drawn more people than Emily had expected. A live band played soft jazz in the corner. Families filled the booths, laughter spilling into the air. The scent of fried catfish and cornbread filled the room. Emily stood near the counter, watching it all unfold. Luis leaned in. Not bad, Carter. She smirked. Told you. Frank grumbled from beside them. If this many people came in every night, I'd retire early. Emily grinned. Guess we'll have to make this a regular thing. Frank muttered something under his breath, but the corner of his mouth twitched. The night was a success. But then, the bell above the door jingled. The room didn't go silent. No one noticed, but Emily did. Standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, was Clint Eastwood. He didn't walk in right away. He stood there momentarily, scanning the room and taking it all in. Then slowly he stepped inside. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached, heart pounding. Didn't think we'd see you again, she said. Clint gave a slight nod. Heard there was something worth coming back for. She glanced around at the lively diner. Guess we're doing all right. His eyes met hers. Looks like you are. For a moment, they stood there. Then, Clint reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Emily tensed. Not again. She shook her head. You don't have to. It's not what you think, Clint said, setting it on the counter. Then, with a final nod, he turned and walked out. Emily watched him go. When she finally opened the envelope, her breath caught. No check, just a note. You did good. I knew you would. A slow smile spread across her lips. This time, she didn't feel like crying. She felt like standing taller. Because for the first time in her life, she knew exactly where she was going.